been a year since the horrific attacks of October 7th. Those attacks and the war that has ensued since, and the reactions to the war, all have raised urgent questions and exposed important issues in our culture, trends and ideas that have horrified people, from quads of universities to the streets of major cities and capitals around the world. Looking back at that, what are some important takeaways? Welcome to the podcast. I'm Elan Journo. Joining me today is Onkar Ghate. Onkar, let's dive in. And I'm interested in your perspective on this last year that we've been tracking and commenting on here on the podcast. What would you highlight as one important lesson or takeaway?
I would highlight that something's apparent now that I think should have been apparent a year ago, but wasn't, which is that Israel's at war with Iran. It's more, I think if you said that now, it's more plausible given the recent attacks of the missile launches from Iran into Israel that people would, yeah, maybe that's right, that Israel is at war with Iran. But if you think of what happened in October 7th and some of the conceptualization of this, it's a gang of terrorists who breached the border with Israel and committed a massacre. That, I think, is a complete misconceptualization of what Hamas is. I think it should be thought of as it's the governing body of Gaza, not just a gang of terrorists. It's the governing body of Gaza that's dedicated to the overthrow of Israel. And it's a proxy sponsored by Iran. That's the source of its power and its ability to govern. And in that sense, it's just an extension of Iran. And that was it. So that already was an attack from Iran on Israel. And that Iran's now rallying to the side. First, they rallied to Hamas, now to Hezbollah. Just shows that that's how Iran thinks of these groups. And it's past time for both Israel, but the wider Western world to recognize that, to acknowledge that fact, and then to think what has to be done in light of that fact.
Yeah, just to add to what you're saying, I read an article just the other day on the day after Iran's most recent rocket attack on Israel in the New York Times. And in the New York Times, of all places, this is what I should add, there was an outlining of the ways in which Iran has relationships with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and the militias in Iraq. And the gist of this article and the maps that go along with it is Iran sees itself as the center of an axis of resistance. That's the term they use. And the article is pointing out the ways in which Iran cooperates and sponsors and trains and funds and arms these groups. And my takeaway from that was, finally, there's some recognition that there's a unity to all of this, that these aren't discrete battles, that October 7th wasn't simply one front, it was a significant part of the whole, and that the day after, when Hezbollah in Lebanon started firing rockets, that was not a distinct and separate conflict. That was one other piece of the same big picture. But in thinking about how people are viewing this, and I agree with you, this is long past time, there is still a significant gap. So I don't want to suggest that people are coming around to it. It's becoming harder to not see it, is the way I'm thinking about it. But there's still something really important that's not being recognized. And one way to explore that point is, you put it as it's a conflict between Israel and Iran, and I fully agree with that. And that's part of how I talk about it in the book, What Justice Demands, and in many of the commentaries we've done on this podcast and in articles and talks over the many years we've been commenting on the Islamic totalitarian movement. But that still is not a sufficient philosophic perspective on this, which is that Iran isn't just another country, and it's too easy to fall into the perspective that many people have. And I think there's reasons they fall into it, which is Iran isn't a bad neighborhood. It's supportive of the Palestinians, and who could do anything else? It's a completely rational perspective on what they're doing. They're sympathetic with a downtrodden group. I think that's a complete misconceptualization. And I think a rational framing of this issue is that Iran is, as many people have put it, it's a revolution disguised as a country. It's an ideological enterprise. It's a country that is dominated by an explicit set of ideas rooted in Islam that has totalitarian ambitions, and consciously trying to export those ideas and impose them on people and collaborate with other factions and groups to do that. And it's reflected in its imperial ambitions. It's reflected in its sponsorship of terrorism. So terrorism then is a means that it sometimes uses, that some of its subcontractors use, but that's not the essential, to go back to the point you raised and how people thought of October 7th. That is not the essential. The essential is the set of ideas that they are embracing and trying to implement. So I regard it as a totalitarian movement seeking to dominate people. And Israel in this context it's important that we put on the table how we think of it, and it's not primarily as a country that is defined by its collective identity or religious identity, though those are important pieces of what Israel is and how it sees itself. The virtue of Israel, in my understanding and how I argue this point, is in the aspects of it that are more individualistic and that protect individual rights and that make it an essentially free society. And in that sense, when you zoom out and think about what this conflict is about, it's a totalitarian movement rooted in Iran seeking to overthrow and destroy a basically free society. And when you zoom in and you look at Hamas and its war against Israel, Hezbollah and its wars against Israel, and the reason the Houthis are involved, and the reason all these different pieces of it, that's what unites them, that they have a hostility to freedom and as embodied in Israel as a free society. And I think that's the essential issue that should be clearer, and it's not hidden by any of the participants, but that's the piece that I think isn't really well understood. Interested in your reactions to that.
Yes, it isn't well understood. But as you say, Iran understands it, that they can view it simultaneously and as a unity, that their enemies, Israel and the United States, what unites those two things is not, well, these are two Jewish homelands or something like that. What unites them is that they're representatives of Western civilization, of relatively free and so civilized places. And that's what Iran considers. And rightly, like, given their ideology, given what it is that they're seeking to impose Islam by force, to have total control over a nation and of its life, its political life, but more widely its culture, as one sees in Iran. The enemy of that is freedom. The enemy of that is a free society. And so Iran understands what their enemy is. And because they are ideological, they can see, yeah, our enemy is united by a certain ideological perspective that we have to defeat. It's we who can't see that. And I think it's that we can't see it is part kind of blindness that's excusable. Not excusable, it doesn't mean it's correct. It's just one can understand it, and part evasive. So one way that Ayn Rand put it is evasion is willful blindness. So part of the blindness is not so deliberate, and part of it is deliberate. And say something about what's not deliberate about it. Given the dominance of pragmatism and the teaching of pragmatism in the Western world in the 20th century, and it got worse as the 20th century went on. Ayn Rand, if you read her essays, there's many that are talking about the impact and influence of pragmatism, and which was an especially American philosophy that sort of partly developed in America and designed to appeal to Americans, that it's practical, it's about getting things done, you're not lost in the cloud of abstractions in the ivory tower. And Americans very much thought of that, yeah, we're the kind of people who, we have a can-do attitude, we can get things done, I guess we should be pragmatic. But what pragmatism as a philosophy preached is a hostility to principles, to abstractions, to generalizations. All that's hot air. It maybe you can talk about it in the ivory tower, but it has no practical impact or import. And the more and more that seeped into policymakers' mind, and more broadly, just the intellectual public who's trying to understand the world, trying to think what our foreign policy should be, it made it not just a disdain from principles, but that nobody can take principles seriously. And the translation in terms of thinking about foreign policy is that nobody can really take an ideology seriously. Everybody knows it's just hot air, it's just words. So Iran might talk about Islam and that they want to bring Islam through the whole world. They might talk about doctrines and so on, but that's all just hot air. That's not what really motivates them. That's not what moves them. It's about money and rectifying grievances and so on. And if we could address those piecemeal in some set of negotiations, we would be able to win them over. And that is, it's completely false, but that's what their education is pounded into their heads. And if you take it seriously, it's everybody knows ideology's bunk, so who could possibly think it has any importance in the world?
One of the ways I see that manifesting in this foreign policy issue is, for many years there was a view of Iran, and this was particularly salient during the Obama years, when Obama was crusading for a nuclear agreement with Iran, and eventually he got it. And this was the crown of his diplomatic efforts. There was a view which I often look back on and think this is a fragmenting of a unity. So it's a fragmenting of Iran into multiple personalities. If you want a psychological analog, like this idea of having multiple personalities. So there's the Iran that oppresses its own people within its borders. That's one kind of problem. There's the Iran that sponsors terrorist groups. That's another problem. There's the Iran that is building a nuclear weapon or trying to become a nuclear state. That's another problem. There's the Iran that's building ballistic missiles. That's still another problem, another personality. And you keep going. And then there's the Iran that's constantly vilifying the US and Israel in its sermons on Fridays. That's still another person. And you keep going. And every aspect of what unites Iran, this ideological character, is fragmented into, well, these are separate issues. We don't have to deal with them. You have to think about what is the priority, and this is sort of the pragmatism. We've got to get things done. Let's not get hung up on the ideas and the principles involved here. And what this takes the form of is the Iran nuclear deal, which was focused on Iran's nuclear program, not its ballistic missile program, not its sponsorship of terrorism, not its oppression of people within Iran, and not anything else. It was highly siloed in that sense. And this was one of the things people celebrated about it, because we're just taking apart the big problem, one segment of the problem, and dealing just with that. And we'll come back to the human rights issue in another time, and that's not really true. So this fragmenting of Iran into different kinds of issues and treating them as discrete and disconnected. And I think this is the important piece of it, is disconnected, not looking for the thread, not looking for what brings it together. That, I think, is a manifestation of this anti-principle, anti-conceptual perspective. Because to be principled is to look for the things, to be guided by an overarching perspective and bring the concrete under it and think about how a particular action should be understood and evaluated. And that's what we saw. And the consequence of this, one of the consequences of this, is it makes it easier to dismiss everything the Iranians say. Who cares what they actually say? It's what we're really concerned with is this nuclear program. Why do they want one? Why do they paint the names of Israeli cities on their rockets? Why do they put American flags on their missiles? We don't have to think about that. What we need to think about is how to get them to slow down, regardless of why they're trying to become a nuclear power. And there's different metaphors people use about an elephant in the room, or ignoring what's in front of your nose, or trees for the fire. None of those really does justice to the willful disregard of the power and the role of ideas in moving Iran as shaping and defining its goals and its actions. And that's precisely what this pragmatist mentality it does. It's sort of it's self-crippling in being unable to understand what they're dealing with, and then you end up with a nuclear deal that doesn't really solve the problem, because you can't solve the problem through this means. It's not solvable through diplomatic means. But I think that's a really salient problem, and it reinforces itself because if you don't take seriously what Iran tells you, they keep doing what they're doing, and the problem gets worse.
Yeah, and that's part of what is difficult to understand here. It's not as though Iran is hiding its ideology. They openly proclaim it. You can read speeches of where they're talking about their vision for Islam dominating the world, of America as the great Satan. They say it over and over again. But to a pragmatist, it just goes in one ear and out the other, because in effect, as most people will do, you project yourself onto others. So, and a pragmatist thinks abstract ideas don't have any resonance in my mind. They don't do anything. That's not what guides me. I'm trying to focus on the concrete situation and figure out what to do without being hindered. And they really think of it as being hindered by abstractions and principles. Like, that's how I function. Everybody must function like that. So even though Iran tells you over and over, no, we're guided by an ideology, to a pragmatist, it's no, that can't be true. And that's just a cover for something that what is it that they really want? More oil or more money, and let's form a deal that gets them that. And that's the sense in which it's not willful blindness completely. It's just blindness. They've been crippled by the education that they've been given, but they're not completely innocent. That they've been taught and accepted, and the accepted is part of what's not. People can't force ideas down your throat. You have to participate in their acceptance of it. But that's what our whole foreign policy regime has been, at least maybe put it, dominated by in the last 50 plus years.
I just want to share an example of this that's specific to Hamas. So prior to October 7th, I forget exactly the date, but it's several months, maybe a bit longer than that, prior to the attack of October 7th. And it's useful to keep in mind the attacks of October 7th weren't planned the night before. They were clearly planned long, long in advance, and just the preparation and the tunnels and so forth, which we talked about in other contexts. But it's so clear that it was a long-term strategy and a lot of steps to get to that date. The concrete example I wanted to raise in this context is some months before that attack, there was a conference that was sponsored or led by Hamas and some of its people. And the concept behind it, or the question on the table, was, what does it look like when we've eradicated Israel? What does society look like? What do we do with the Jews? Do we put them in? Do we kill them all? Do we send them out of the country? Do we expel them? All these sort of day after questions. And what's striking about this is nothing to be surprised by. This is what their charter from founding has been aimed at, is to raise to the ground a free society and an industrial, technologically advanced society, to destroy it. And here they are, they're having conferences with different people specializing in this and political questions, and they really mean this. They really take this seriously. And that doesn't make headlines. That doesn't really resonate with people. I think a few people have noticed this now looking back. This was something that Hamas sponsored and was taking part in. That's what they're about, and they're telling you. So this is on the same theme that Iran is not hiding what they're about. Hamas is not hiding what they're about. And if you think about Hezbollah, which has been in the news, particularly now on the eve of looking back at a year since October 7th. So the most recent thing that's happened is Israel has assassinated the leader of Hezbollah, in addition to other attacks within Lebanon, and to neutralize their military capability of Hezbollah. The Hezbollah has been talking about eradicating Israel. Their goal is similar to Hamas. They're in alliance with Hamas. They share the same goal, and they're working, maybe not hand in glove coordination, but clearly they took advantage of the day after October 7th to start their rocket attack. So not listening to what they say is, I think it's understandable for the reasons you mentioned, but there is culpability here. And I think it's significant and worth unpacking what is it about people's thinking? What ideas do they have that would make it harder for them, or not? What obstacles are there for them, or what inducements are there for them to not want to see what's in front of them? I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think of part of the willful blindness here and evidence of the willful blindness that they're trying to have some kind of pretense, some kind of pseudo explanation, some kind of um, explanation that doesn't have to bring in what Iran and its satellites are actually after, which is the domination in a, as you said at the outset, a totalitarian domination in the name of Islam, of whatever territory they can capture, and because that's what's driving them, their enemy, their principal enemy, is a free society, and so Israel and the United States, and they hold it like that. That so pragmatism can explain some of the blindness, but it's so uh, um, obvious. And as we've said, Iran will say over and over that what they're actually after is this totalitarian cause. And there's so much evidence that that's really what they're after, including what they've done in Iran to their own people. What you have is a totalitarian nightmare in Iran. So there's so much evidence that this, what they say they're after, is what they're actually after. That you can't just, pragmatism can't explain, oh, you can't see this. So you have to be having mechanisms to push it out of mind. And so that's the willful blindness, to not want to see it and to be working not to see it. And one of the ways in which a person can remain willfully blind is to erect, but this is part of it, like it takes work on the person's part, to erect a pseudo explanation. Oh, this is what Iran is after. This is what it cares about. And I think one of the main pseudo explanations is what they care about, and more widely, the totalitarians in the Middle East, what they care about is that the Palestinians have been treated unjustly. The Palestinians have legitimate grievances. And if those were addressed and rectified, then we'd be fine and we put down our arms and we would just want to live in peace and prosperity with both, like within our country, with our fellow citizens, and across the wider Middle East. And so, I mean, that's obviously an explanation that's given over and over about, and this is why we need a two-state solution, and we have to address the plight and cause of the Palestinians. That nobody can really believe this if you were thinking about it. There's many elements, I think, that would go into what does it mean to really think about this. But one of the ways that I think that is helpful to think about it is remove Israel from the equation. Like one of the ways I think about it is imagine you could transport Israel, all the people, and the infrastructure that it's built in the country, transport it to Mars. They're going to live on Mars now. We've made it habitable, and so they're gone. The alleged thorn in their side is gone. Would the Palestinian territories, would it be now free and prosperous? No, it would look like Iran. Hezbollah and Hamas would try to seize as much power and control as they can, and as they have, say, in Gaza. I mean, prior to Israel wiping out a large part of Hamas, and they would rule in a dictatorial, totalitarian fashion as the rulers of Iran did. If you actually cared about the individuals in these places who actually genuinely yearn for freedom, eliminating Israel does zero, and like worse than zero, for them and their aspirations for freedom. At least Israel can serve as a model. Like, we want that and not what you guys do here in our territories or in Iran. With that gone, all you have is despotism or worse, and their plight will be worse than what it is, and it's bad now if you live under Hamas's rule, say. And that just it if you think about it for 15, 20 minutes. It can't be that the cause here, the root cause, is Israel. It's the root cause is their own ideology. But again, that's what they don't want to face and confront. So you have a pseudo explanation. Oh, if only the grievances were addressed.
Yeah, just to add to that, the issue of grievances is all over, and that's one of the things we saw since October 7th on college campuses, with college students coming out expressing sympathy for Palestinians, and in many cases, I think actually sympathy for Hamas and Hezbollah, because you see Hamas and Hezbollah flags on college campuses at these encampments that we saw last semester. So there's some fantasy story that is being told to make it seem like this is what really is going on. And I mean, there's two other reflections on this. One is to the first point that we talked about. What is the conflict really about? There are really two stories for that. One is the reality, which what we've been arguing, that this is an ideological conflict. It's between Israel and Iran, and the hinge is about whether you have a society that's free or a society that's totalitarian. And then there's a story that people are hearing, particularly from protesters, about this is really about Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And I think that that's just not really the essential issue. That's not the essential issue. And I say this, I mentioned my book, What Justice Demands. I spent a long time researching that book and writing it. And we worked on this together. And you gave me a lot of great feedback on the book. And I spent a long time thinking through the issues. And one of the things I tell people is the longest chapter in that book, and even then it could have been longer, is about the Palestinian grievances, because it's a complicated issue. And I have a view that there are actual grievances that certain individual Palestinians do have against Israel. I think they have been wronged in narrow, definable ways that you could identify. And there's a separate question of how do you rectify that? I don't think the primary grievances that you hear about are right or credible. And this is one reason people should go read the book, just explore this issue and see what you think as I lay out the history and the issues at stake. But even saying that, even acknowledging, and I think let me just give the concrete example. I think one of the actual ongoing wrongs that you can point to is that there are Palestinians or Israeli Arab citizens whose land is being encroached upon by religious fanatics who are Jews, trying to expropriate them, or create these so-called encampments and settlements, and then using the power of the state and their ability to influence politicians and have them turn a blind eye to this. And that's a really significant problem. That is the violation of the rule of law. It's a violation of property rights. There's no place in Israel, and I think it's a mark against Israel, a dark mark, a black mark against it, that it allows for this to happen. And I criticize this heavily in the book, and there's many ways in which this is an ongoing issue. And there's further kinds of problems where you see religious fanatic Jews who are going and targeting Palestinians, literally harming them, attacking them, and violating their right to life and liberty. And that's wrong as well. And that's something that the police and the security forces should be cracking down on. And to the extent that they don't, or they're complicit in it, or they're omitting to, that is a significant problem. So there's just one example of where I think there's actual wrongs. But solving that, which I think needs to be solved, would not, to reinforce your point, every solution to that, none of that would help with the Iran problem or the Hamas problem. Because the reality is that what Iran and Hamas are after, and what Hezbollah are after, is not that the Palestinians' actual rights be protected, is that there be no one whose rights are protected. Because what they really want is a society that looks nothing like Israel, a society where you can't have redress against the state, because it's a society that is a dictatorial, religious, authoritarian, and there's the whole range of degrees in which they would want to accomplish their goal, and it might be incremental. So the essential issue in my mind is that the grievances, even where you can point to ones that I think are actual wrongs that need to be rectified, solving those does not solve the essential conflict, because the essential conflict is not about the protection of Palestinians. I think they don't really care about the Palestinians. As you said, I think you're being generous by saying 20 minutes. Maybe they need 10 minutes to learn more about the facts. But to me, it's not credible that a dictatorial power can be taken seriously as having any concern for individual rights if in its own country it is crushing protesters who want to live free of religious tyranny, who want individual rights, who want the freedom of speech, that's what happens in Iran, and who then funds to the tune of millions of dollars Hezbollah and Hamas against the wishes of Iranians who are protesting the fact that their government is sponsoring these groups, in order for those two groups to create new and other totalitarian societies in the territories that they control. So it's completely incoherent if you take the idea of individual rights seriously and you have a concern for individuals who are facing actual wrongs. And I think that is to me I don't. Maybe I'm commenting on this in part from a perspective of having delved into this a lot. Maybe it is a 20-minute, 30-minute exploration. I don't want to underplay the complexity of it, but I think it doesn't take long to see that there's a problem with this explanation, even if you're not convinced it's completely wrong. And then one other thought I just want to put on the table and get your reaction, and we can explore it if you want. But the other one is, I've been emphasizing one kind of grievance that I think is legitimate and worth rectifying, and it's really important. The emphasis I want to leave on the table is that that's the minority. That there's most of the things that you hear about as Palestinian grievances, about land that was taken away 70 plus years ago, about refugees, about the desire for a homeland that's being thwarted year after year, about the perfidy of various diplomatic agreements, and most of that is BS, or it's understood from a frame that is completely biased toward not understanding what the Palestinian movement has become and Iran's role in raising up the Islamists within it. And I think that's even then it's being charitable. So I'm curious about if you have further thoughts on this issue of how the Palestinian grievances play into it.
Yeah, I think I put the last point that you were making, I put it that the essence of the issue of Palestinian grievances is that they're made up and deliberately made up, that what they wanted is a perennial group of people that they could point to, and that there would be some intellectual and moral sympathy to that they've been wronged by Israel, they've been displaced. This is a historic injustice, and until that's rectified, nothing. There can't be peace in the Middle East. We can't move on, in effect. And so, I think if you look at the history of it, there's a deliberate attempt to keep the Palestinians as a apparent a perennial victim of injustice that we can parade over and over again, and it's part of deflecting and camouflaging the real goals and what they're really after, and it's a kind of deflection that has worked. And part of, you were talking about the protesters on the campuses and so on. This is part of what they bring up as though it's uncontroversially true. And if one were thinking about this and thinking about individual people and individual lives, there's something perverse in telling a group of people, and many people bring up, like, Palestinians wasn't an identifiable group 75, 80 years ago and didn't think of themselves. So there was an attempt to make them think of themselves as a group who are perennial victims, who you can't do anything other than try to strive to rectify some historic injustice. And I think that historic injustice is, as you were saying, largely made up, but there's some modicum of actual injustices that happened and that were bad. But to again pound into people, this is how you should think of yourselves. This is what you should think of as your identity, as you're the victims of a historic injustice that you have to sort of wait around for it to be rectified or take up arms to rectify it, versus you can acknowledge the historic injustice, but to move on and to create something positive and to do something with your life. One of the parallels that I think about is because it happened around the same time in the 40s, the division of or partition of India and of Muslims fleeing to Pakistan, of Hindus trying to get out. And there was a real desperation because they're drawing the lines around religious, kind of tribal groups. There was massive bloodshed in the partition, and people worried, and rightly, about wars between Pakistan and India, that there will be continued bloodshed. I mean, the estimates are 15 million who are fleeing, deaths from the low to, I mean, 200, I mean, low, I mean, it's not 200,000 to a million or 2 million people killed in this partition. And if you said that now, look, your identity as an Indian should be to just think about all that this injustice, it has to be rectified. You can't move on unless it's rectified. Of telling someone like that's how they should think about themselves and their lives, there's something really evil in trying to make that's your identity now. And thankfully, I mean, it's certainly not, I think, anywhere close to perfect in India, and it's much worse in Pakistan. But there's a way that they've moved on, and you can recognize, yeah, there was a lot of injustice in that partition, but it can't define you for century after century and now form your identity. And if you're trying to pound that into someone's head, I think the motivation of doing so is bad. And in this case, as I say, it's a means to camouflage what is actually going on. And it's a means of sort of whitewashing Iran's evil, Hamas is evil, Hezbollah is evil, of saying, no, look, we're just fighting against injustice. And no, what you are is what you want, and what animates you is you want to be the perpetrator of injustice, not the rectifier of it.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of what's so somber about this. Not only the lives that were taken on October 7th itself, but the year that has passed, where there should have been, and I think there should have been much more reflection on how we got to that point, and the history of the policies that led to it, which we've talked about in other podcasts. But to me, this is the overarching issue of understanding the power and the role of philosophic ideas. And this is something we've been talking about for a long time. It takes a direct line to the way Ayn Rand analyzes culture and how she gave philosophy such a fundamental role in understanding culture and people's lives. And I think there's a certain challenge here, which is for me to think, in analyzing these issues, I see it everywhere. I see the power of philosophic ideas animating the Palestinian movement and the Hamas faction within it, and Iran and Hezbollah, and I see that. And I also see it in Israel, and the ways in which the bad philosophic ideas that they hold are weakening their society and making it less able to defend itself and less free as well. And I see it in the sort of one of the issues we've talked about in the last year as well, the conduct of the war as colored by a particular moral premise that is defining the rules of war, the so-called international laws of war, and how Israel, it strives to live up to these laws, and it goes out of its way to advertise the fact that it follows these rules. But these philosophic ideas that define those rules of law are themselves, I would put it this way, they're rigged such that the more you try to live up to them, the more they undercut you. And in that sense, that Israel is being undercut by bad philosophic ideas, which is an issue that it's sort of self-sacrificial in its approach to this war, as it has been in previous rounds of war, and it's colored its policy towards the Palestinians for many, many years. And I think it's also evident in American policy, which is not a topic we've talked about at all today, but I think it's in the background of the advocacy for a two-state solution and America's role as a sponsor of that, and America's position as a self-declared loyal and stalwart ally of Israel. I think America's policy has been colored by both the pragmatism that we talked about earlier, that dominates a lot of thinking on foreign policy, and that makes it hard to really understand what's going on and come to analyses that lead to better policy. it's self-crippling in that sense. And then there's the more culpable aspects of not wanting to see it and inventing stories and latching on to pretext, which I think this is where the grievances come in. And I think it's the thread that runs through all of this is just the way in which philosophic ideas, particularly in this case, irrational philosophic ideas, lead people to want to murder and dominate and tyrannize other people. And then where good people adopt bad ideas, it disarms them. And that is one of the tragedies here, is that the US and Israel are both the targets here and the victims of this movement, but they're not capable of responding to it effectively despite their military strength. They're just undercut by the ideas that they have accepted. So to me, that's a through line through all of this, that it's a point that I take from studying Ayn Rand's philosophy, is that, as she puts it in many contexts in many of her articles, it's what you're seeing in the world today is not evidence that philosophy is irrelevant or impotent. It's proof that philosophy is everywhere and fundamentally powerful. And part of what is so valuable about, I think, her philosophy is that it attunes you to that. It makes you sensitive to that as a causal factor in understanding the world. And I think the other aspect that it gives you is this orientation to the facts and not to what you want to be true. And just this commitment to recognizing what's there and not shrinking from it, not reaching for rationalizations that would make you feel more comfortable. And I think those two together, it's not the only thing to get from her philosophy, but these are really central to how I think of these issues and how I think our commentary has been differentiated in this context.
Yeah, and just as a capstone on that, of bringing in some of the U.S. policy, I found it not surprising but horrible when Israel, when they killed Hezbollah's leader, some of the U.S. response from the State Department was something like, "No one's mourning his death. He had American blood on his hands," which is true. They have perpetrated attacks not just against Israel, but against America, American interests, American soldiers. And the idea that you can know, like, this guy is a killer of Americans, and we've let them be. And let them be is understatement, because if you put them with Hezbollah and Hamas as their allies, and they clearly view themselves as allies, we helped bring Hamas into power in the Gaza Strip. And we're doing that knowing they have American blood on their hands. And there's no practical explanation you can give of this, that it's some complex scheme. Yeah, we know they're real bad guys, but we're playing them off against worse guys. There's no explanation that's plausible in that regard. You can't explain it unless you understand that there's philosophical ideas at work, and that our response to 9/11, of why we went after Iraq and left Iran alone, and indeed the result of that was to empower Iran in Iraq and other places as well, is that, I can conceive of Saddam Hussein as being a bad guy because he was, and it's right, he and especially his sons have a real sadistic, evil element in that. So you can paint him as a monster, and removing a monster, that's something good, and we should do that. But these religiously motivated people who say they're after helping their fellow souls in these regions, and part of the way Hamas was presented is they're going to bring schools and hospitals because they're religiously motivated. It has to be good. So maybe, we certainly shouldn't attack them, but maybe we should help them come into power. And so that's the explanation of what we were doing. It's the way that they processed the facts, and that knowing these people have American blood on their hands. And that, it didn't surprise me, because I know this of the way that they think. But to anybody wondering about what's going on and finding it difficult to understand, that should be one of the things that no practical explanation it is a real explanation of why that would have been our policy. But if you bring in a philosophical perspective and try to understand the way philosophically our policy makers were viewing the Middle East and the way they view the world, what is seemingly unintelligible becomes intelligible.
I think that's a good place for us to draw a line. I just recommend for everyone listening today, if you want some resources on this, Onkar and I put together a book called Failing to Confront Islamic Totalitarianism, What Went Wrong After 9/11. It looks back at about 20 years of America's response to the Middle East and the issues we talked about today. And the book that I worked on that I mentioned earlier, What Justice Demands, America and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, unpacks this conflict. As I mentioned, I have an analysis of many of the salient grievances, and I talk about what it would look like to understand them from an individualist perspective that values human life and human freedom. And I recommend that book for everyone. It's been particularly well received after October 7th, and I'm glad for people to have had the benefit to learn from that book. So I encourage everyone now, as they reflect on where we are a year later, if you haven't taken a look at that, it's available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. So with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you.